I want you to think about something for a second. The most expensive thing that happened at the end of February this year hasn't even fully shown up in your life yet. Not in your bank account, not in your bills, not in your day-to-day spending. And when it finally does hit, months from now, most people won't even connect it back to what caused it. That's the part that makes this different, because this isn't just about gas prices going up. This is about a chain reaction that's already in motion, quietly working its way toward your wallet. And the reason I'm talking about it now is simple. Timing. If you understand it early, you adjust early. If you don't, it just feels like life is getting randomly more expensive, and you can't figure out why. So let's talk about what's actually happening in a real, practical way. Not news headlines, not politics, just how this plays out in everyday life. At the end of February, something happened overseas that most people barely paid attention to. It looked like just another headline, but within days it triggered a ripple effect across energy, shipping, food production, travel, and even interest rates. And those effects don't hit all at once. They come in waves. Right now, most people are only seeing the first one, gas. You've probably already felt it. You pull up to the pump, you see the price, you do that quick mental math, and you think, yeah, that's annoying, but I can handle it. And you move on. That reaction is completely normal, but it's also incomplete. Because gas is just the beginning. Here's the part most people miss. Fuel doesn't just power your car. It powers everything that gets delivered to you. Every truck on the road, every shipment of groceries, every product sitting on a shelf. When fuel costs go up, it doesn't stay isolated. It spreads. Quietly. And it spreads fast. You don't see it immediately in stores, because businesses don't raise prices overnight. They wait. They absorb what they can. They adjust slowly. But eventually, it shows up. And when it does, it doesn't feel like one big spike. It feels like everything is just slightly more expensive than it used to be. And you can't quite explain why. Imagine this. You go grocery shopping like you always do. Same store. Same kind of items. But somehow, the total is higher. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. You think maybe you grabbed a few extra things. Next week, it happens again. And again. That's how this works. It's not loud. It's not obvious. It's gradual. But it adds up. And here's where it gets more interesting. There's another layer to this that most people never think about. Food production. Not just transportation, actual production. A huge part of growing food depends on fertilizer, and fertilizer depends heavily on energy. When energy gets disrupted, fertilizer becomes more expensive. When fertilizer becomes more expensive, farmers have to make decisions. They might plant less. They might switch crops. They might cut back. And those decisions don't affect you tomorrow. They affect you months later. By the time it shows up, you've completely forgotten what started it. All you know is that certain foods cost more, or they're harder to find, and it feels random, but it's not random. It's delayed. Now let's bring this back to everyday life again. Summer. Travel. Flights. This is another place where things start to shift. Airlines run on fuel. When fuel costs go up, ticket prices follow. But they don't adjust instantly. They build those costs into pricing over time. So what you see today is usually cheaper than what you'll see next month. That's why sometimes you check a flight, wait a bit, come back later, and it's suddenly way more expensive. It's not just demand. It's cost catching up. And then there's the part that almost nobody connects. Interest rates. This one doesn't feel connected at all, but it is. When energy costs rise, inflation tends to rise with it. And when inflation stays high, interest rates don't come down the way people expect. That affects everything. Loans, credit cards, mortgages, even savings. It's one of those things you don't notice day to day, but it quietly shapes your financial situation over time. Maybe you were waiting for rates to drop. Maybe you were planning to refinance something, and then it just doesn't happen. That's not random either. Now here's where this really matters, because none of this is about fear, and it's not about panic. It's about awareness. There are always going to be things happening in the background of the economy that you can't control. But what you can control is how early you recognize them and what you do next. Most people don't make huge mistakes during times like this. They don't suddenly lose everything. It's much quieter than that. They just keep doing everything the same way while the environment around them changes. And that gap slowly costs them money. Not all at once, but consistently. On the other side, the people who come out of situations like this in better shape, they don't do anything dramatic either. They just adjust earlier. Small things. Practical things. They pay a little more attention to where their money is going. They reduce unnecessary spending before it starts to hurt. They stay consistent with saving and investing instead of reacting emotionally. They make decisions ahead of the curve instead of behind it. And maybe the most important part of all this, they don't let short-term fear push them into long-term mistakes. Because when things feel uncertain, the instinct is to pause everything, to wait, to pull back. But historically, that's where people lose the most. Not because the situation itself was devastating, but because of how they reacted to it. So if you take anything from this, let it be this. What's happening right now isn't just a temporary inconvenience. It's a series of changes that will show up over time. Some of them you've already seen. Some of them you haven't felt yet. And some of them won't make sense when they happen, unless you understand the bigger picture. You don't need to overcomplicate it. You don't need to predict everything. You just need to be a little more aware than average, a little earlier than most, and a little more intentional with your decisions. Because in situations like this, that small difference is what adds up the most. And months from now, when people are wondering why everything feels more expensive, you won't be guessing. You'll already know. And, more importantly, you'll already be prepared. And the thing is, most people won't even notice when the shift actually happens. There won't be a moment where everything suddenly clicks and makes sense. It'll just feel like life got a little tighter, a little more expensive, a little harder to keep up with. And that feeling builds slowly. You start hesitating a bit more before buying things you didn't think twice about before. You notice your paycheck doesn't stretch the way it used to. You tell yourself it's temporary, that things will go back to normal soon. But normal quietly changes while you're waiting. Let me say something honestly. This isn't about being negative. It's actually the opposite. Because once you understand what's happening, you stop feeling confused. You stop blaming yourself for things that aren't random. And you start making decisions with clarity instead of guesswork. Think about how most people handle money when things feel uncertain. They either ignore it or they overreact. They pretend nothing is changing, or they panic and try to change everything overnight. Both usually lead to the same outcome: more stress, more mistakes, more money slipping through the cracks. But there's a middle ground that almost nobody talks about. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel exciting. But it works. It's just adjusting early, before things force you to. Maybe that looks like paying closer attention to your monthly spending, not in a restrictive way, just in an aware way. Actually noticing where your money is going, because small leaks matter a lot more when everything else is getting more expensive. Maybe it's rethinking convenience, the little things that feel harmless on their own, but stack up over time. Because when prices quietly rise in the background, those habits become more expensive without you realizing it. Maybe it's finally taking high-interest debt seriously. Not later, not when things settle down. Now, because when everything else gets more expensive, that interest becomes heavier, it sticks around longer, and it costs more than people expect. And, at the same time, not stopping the things that actually build your future. That's where people get tripped up. They cut the wrong things. They pause investing. They pull back completely. They wait for the perfect time to feel safe again, and that moment usually never comes the way they imagined. Because the truth is, the times that feel the most uncertain are often the times that matter the most long term. They're uncomfortable. They're unpredictable. But they're also where the biggest gaps are created between people who stay consistent and people who step out and try to time everything. You don't have to be perfect with any of this. You don't have to predict exactly what's going to happen next. Nobody can. All you really need is to not be late. Just being a little early, a little more aware, a little more intentional. That's enough. Because what's happening right now isn't just one event. It's a chain of effects that unfold over time. Some obvious, some completely invisible until they show up in your life, and by the time most people connect the dots, the opportunity to adjust early is already gone. So instead of reacting later, you move now, quietly, without panic, without overthinking, just small, smart shifts. And the difference that creates, it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. Nobody sees it. Nobody applauds it. But over time, it shows up in your life in a very real way. Less stress, more control, more breathing room when things get tight. That's really what this is about. Not predicting the future, not worrying about every headline, just understanding enough to stay one step ahead of the moment when it finally reaches you. Because it will reach you, in some form, at some point. That part isn't optional. But how prepared you are when it does, that part is completely up to you. And if you've made it this far, just know this. You're already ahead of most people. Now it's just about what you do with that awareness. And here's something most people don't realize until much later. It's not the big expenses that slowly drain you during times like this. It's the small ones that adjust quietly in the background. A few extra dollars here, a slightly higher bill there, something you barely notice in the moment, but over weeks and months, it builds into something real. And because it happens gradually, you don't react to it the way you would a sudden expense. You adapt to it without even thinking. That's what makes it powerful. You might even find yourself working harder, earning the same, but feeling like you're getting less. That gap can be frustrating because it doesn't come with a clear explanation. It just feels like you're falling slightly behind, even when you're doing everything right. And this is where mindset becomes just as important as money. Because when things feel uncertain, it's easy to slip into reaction mode. You start making decisions based on how things feel in the moment, instead of what actually makes sense long term. You might delay decisions that would have helped you. You might hold on to habits that are quietly costing you more now than they used to. Or you might hesitate to take action, waiting for clarity that never really comes. But clarity doesn't come first. Action does, even small action. Sometimes it's as simple as being more intentional with timing, doing things a little earlier than you normally would, paying attention a little sooner, making adjustments before they become necessary instead of after. Because once something becomes urgent, you lose options. You're forced into decisions instead of choosing them, and those decisions are almost always more expensive. Right now, you still have options. That's the difference. That's the window most people miss. And I think that's the part people underestimate the most. How valuable timing really is. Not perfect timing, just earlier timing. Because when you move early, you're calm. You're thinking clearly. You're not rushed. You're not reacting to pressure. You're simply adjusting. But when you move late, everything feels heavier, more urgent, more stressful, and usually more expensive. So instead of asking, what's going to happen next? A better question is, what can I do now while things are still manageable? Maybe that means building a little more breathing room into your finances. Maybe it means simplifying certain habits. Maybe it just means paying attention in a way you didn't before. It doesn't have to be extreme. It just has to be intentional, because the people who stay steady during uncertain times aren't the ones who guessed everything correctly. They're the ones who stayed consistent while everyone else was distracted. They didn't chase every headline. They didn't panic at every change. They just kept doing the right things, even when it didn't feel urgent yet. And over time, that consistency compounds in ways that aren't always obvious right away, but become very clear later. So if you feel like things are shifting right now, you're not imagining it. There is a shift happening. It's just not loud enough for everyone to notice at the same time. But you noticed. You're paying attention. And that already puts you in a different position. From here, it's simple. Not easy, but simple. Stay aware. Stay steady. Make small, smart adjustments when you can. And don't wait for things to force you into action, because by the time it feels obvious to everyone else, the advantage of being early is already gone. And that's really the difference. Not who knows more, not who earns more, just who moves a little sooner and stays consistent while things are still quiet.